Wallace Barlow's voice cut through the heavy silence of the Redemption Creek Town Hall like a blade drawn in anger, and every man seated in that room felt the edge of it against his pride. "She has outworked every man here," Wallace said, his dark eyes fixed on Elder Calhoun with a ferocity that could have stripped bark from a pine tree, "and she deserves their respect." The room erupted. Chairs scraped. Boots struck the floorboards. Voices collided like cattle in a narrow canyon. Elder Hiram Calhoun, 72 years old and built like a man who had never once questioned his own authority, rose slowly from his seat at the head of the long oak table and pressed both hands flat against the wood. His face had gone the color of a summer storm. "You dare stand in this hall," Calhoun said, barely above a whisper, which was somehow worse than shouting, "and defend a woman who has broken our covenant. She signed no deed. She holds no proper title. And the land she works was not hers to claim. She earned that land," Wallace said. "She earned it with her hands and her back and 2 years of labor that would have broken most of these men before the first winter was out." A man near the back called out something ugly. Another laughed, and from the doorway, half hidden in the shadow of the afternoon sun slanting through the entrance, Theresa Dalton stood perfectly still, her jaw set, her hands loose at her sides, listening to a man she barely trusted defend her as though her very survival depended on the words he chose next. It did. She had not asked him to be here. She had not asked anyone for anything. Not once in the 2 years she had lived and bled and fought for every inch of the 47 acres that sat east of Redemption Creek's cattle trail. And yet here Wallace Barlow was, the most proud and stubborn cattleman in 3 counties, planting his boots in front of the most powerful elder in the territory, and telling him he was wrong. Theresa did not know whether to feel rescued or furious. In the end, she felt both, and something else beneath both of those things that she had not yet allowed herself to name. To understand how they had arrived at this moment, you have to go back to the beginning. Not the neat and tidy beginning that stories prefer, but the real one. The beginning that started with grief and desperation, and a woman stepping off a stage coach into a town that had no interest in welcoming her. It was the spring of 1878 when Theresa Dalton first set foot in Redemption Creek, New Mexico territory. She was 26 years old, carrying one carpetbag, a surveyor's map that had cost her the last of her savings, and a death certificate for her father, Robert Dalton, who had died of fever the previous October in Santa Fe. Robert Dalton had staked a claim on 47 acres of grassland east of the main cattle trail 3 years before his death, and when he died, the claim had passed to Theresa, his only living heir. She had never seen the land. She had never expected to need it. She had been living in Santa Fe working as a seamstress and bookkeeper for a dry goods merchant, keeping house for her ailing father, believing that the land was something he would work someday when his health returned. Then his health did not return, and the fever took him in 3 days, and Theresa was left with a claim she did not know how to use and a city that held nothing for her anymore. She sold her father's few belongings, bought passage on a southbound stage, and arrived in Redemption Creek on a Tuesday morning in April with dust on her boots and determination in her heart that was made of something harder than pride. It was necessity. It was the only thing she had left. Redemption Creek was not a large town in 1878, but it was an established one. It had a general store run by a man named Hatch, a livery, a blacksmith's forge, a doctor's office, a saloon called the Painted Pony, a church, a schoolhouse, and a town hall that sat at the center of Main Street like a judge at the head of a courtroom. The town had been organized under a community covenant drafted 8 years earlier when the first settlers arrived, and Elder Hiram Calhoun had been at the center of that covenant from the start. Calhoun was not an evil man exactly. He was a man of his time, which meant he held beliefs about the natural order of things with the same certainty he held about the sun rising in the east. Women in Redemption Creek were wives and mothers and teachers and occasionally shopkeepers. They were not landowners. They were not ranchers. They were not the sort of people who showed up alone, without a husband, and announced that they intended to work 47 acres of grassland for cattle grazing. When Theresa walked into the town hall that first morning to register her claim, Calhoun looked at her the way a man looks at something he finds puzzling and slightly inconvenient. He told her that her father's claim was valid on paper, but that the Covenant's Land Management Committee would need to review her situation before she could begin any improvements. He told her that the review could take several months. He told her, with a smile that was entirely too patient, that she might want to consider finding accommodation in town while she waited and perhaps thinking about what her long-term plans might be. Theresa understood perfectly well what he meant by long-term plans. He meant a husband, he meant dependency, he meant giving up. She thanked him politely, walked out of the town hall, bought a used canvas tent and a week's worth of dried provisions from Hatch's general store, and went out to her land that same afternoon. The 47 acres were in better shape than she had feared. The grass was thick and green from the spring rains, fed by a seasonal creek that ran along the northern boundary and a small permanent spring that surfaced near the center of the property. There was no structure of any kind, no fence, no shelter. There was a stand of cottonwood trees along the creek bank and open sky in every direction, and the distant sound of cattle from the Barlow Ranch, which lay to the west, separated from her property by a stretch of open range and a ridge of low hills. She pitched her tent in the shelter of the cottonwoods, built a fire, heated a tin of beans, and lay awake listening to coyotes and wind and the settling sounds of the dark until she was calm enough to plan. She planned for 3 days before she started working. By the end of the first week, she had mapped the spring's output and determined it could support a small herd. By the end of the second week, she had walked every boundary of her property, marked the corners with cut posts, and begun digging the first of 4 fence post holes. The digging was brutal. The soil was good on the surface but hard-packed clay 18 inches down, and she had only a spade and a post hole digger she had borrowed from the livery's owner, a quiet man named Pico, who had handed the tools over without comment or judgment, and was one of the few people in Redemption Creek who treated her with simple basic decency from the start. She did not meet Wallace Barlow until the 3rd week. She was on her knees at the northern boundary line, using her body weight to drive a fence post into compacted ground, when she heard hoofbeats approaching from the west. She stood, pushing her hair back under her hat, and watched a rider come over the low ridge that separated her property from the open range beyond. He was not what she expected. She had heard of Wallace Barlow before she ever set foot on her land. His reputation preceded him the way a thunderhead precedes a storm. He was 32 years old, the second-generation owner of the Barlow cattle operation, which ran close to 400 head of longhorns across several hundred acres of deeded land and open range. He was known as a fair but unyielding man, someone who had fought through a cattle fever outbreak and 2 brutal droughts without losing his operation, and someone who did not tolerate anything he considered disorder on the range. He rode a dark bay horse with a white blaze on its face, and he sat in the saddle the way men who have spent their lives on horseback sit, as though the horse was simply an extension of themselves. He was tall, with the lean, work-hardened build of a man who had never had the luxury of idleness. His face was brown from sun and wind, and there were lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting across distances. He was, objectively, the kind of man that the territory produced, and that the territory also wore down, and something about his expression when he saw her told her immediately that he had not expected to find a woman working post holes on this particular piece of ground. He stopped his horse at the edge of her boundary line and looked at her for a moment without speaking. "This is Dalton land," Theresa said, before he could say anything else. "I know whose land it is," he said. His voice was low and level, the voice of someone accustomed to being listened to. "Robert Dalton was your father." "He was. I knew him, not well. He came out here twice to look at the property." Seemed like a decent man. He paused. I'm sorry for your loss. She hadn't expected that. The sympathy caught her off guard in a way that the hostility she'd been bracing for would not have. She gave a short nod. Thank you. You're planning to run cattle, he asked, looking at the fence post in her hands. Grazing operation, small to start. He was quiet for a moment, studying the line of posts she had already set. His expression was unreadable, which she would later learn was his default state when he was processing something that surprised him. That's going to take considerable work, he said finally. I'm aware of that, she said. You're doing it alone. I am. He looked at her directly, and she looked back at him with the same steadiness, and something passed between them in that moment that was not warmth exactly and not hostility either. It was something more like recognition, the way two people sometimes see in each other a quality they understand because they possess it themselves. The South Fork of your seasonal creek runs partly across my grazing boundary during high water, he said. It won't be an issue in summer. But in spring and after heavy rain, you'll want to know that. I'll mark it on my survey, she said. He gave a short nod, touched the brim of his hat, and rode back over the ridge. That was all. It lasted perhaps 4 minutes. But Theresa spent a significant portion of that evening thinking about it, and she could not entirely explain why. The months that followed were the hardest of her life, harder even than the months after her father died, because grief was a kind of passivity that required only endurance, while building a cattle operation from nothing required active daily confrontation with every possible obstacle. The land committee's review dragged on through the spring and into early summer. While it was pending, Theresa was technically prohibited from registering cattle in her name or entering into any formal grazing agreements. She used the time to build. She fenced the perimeter of the north pasture using timber she purchased from a mill 60 miles east, hauling the lumber herself in a borrowed wagon because hiring it done would have cost more than she had. She built a small one-room shelter from adobe and timber on a rise near the spring, not a proper house, but solid enough to survive the summer and the rains. She dug drainage channels to direct the spring's overflow into a holding pool she lined with stone, creating a reliable water source for the livestock she intended to bring in the moment the committee gave its approval. She worked from before dawn until after dark. She ate simply. She asked for help only when she absolutely needed it, and mostly from Pico, who remained steady and undemanding in his assistance. She ignored the stares in town, the comments she caught the edges of, the particular silence that fell in the general store sometimes when she came in for supplies. She noticed that Wallace Barlow's ranch hands sometimes worked the open range land adjacent to her western fence line, and she noticed that whenever they did, they were careful not to let their cattle press against the fence she had built. She did not know whether this was Barlow's instruction or simple habit, but she was grateful for it either way. She saw Wallace himself occasionally, usually at a distance, sometimes in town at the general store or the livery. He did not speak to her again for several weeks after their first meeting, but when they did cross paths, he acknowledged her with a nod that was neither dismissive nor particularly warm, just steady, as though her presence on her land was something he had accepted as a simple fact of the landscape. It was at the end of June that he came to her land again, this time on foot, leading his horse, which had pulled up lame on the open range and required rest before the walk back to the Barlow ranch. He stopped at her water trough because it was the closest source, and she was in the process of reinforcing the corner post of her northern fence and saw him from 20 yards away. She walked over and held the trough's gate open so the horse could drink freely. "Thank you," he said. "The leg." He crouched and ran his hand down the horse's right foreleg with practiced efficiency. "Probably a stone bruise, nothing broken. I have some willow bark poultice in my kit if it's useful," she said. She kept a medical supply box for herself, since the doctor's office was 12 miles from her land, and she could not afford to be out of commission. He looked up at her with that same unreadable expression. "You know horses." "I know enough," she said. My father kept 2 when I was a child, and I've been doing my own veterinary work out here since I can't afford a professional call every time. He accepted the poultice without making it a larger moment than it was, applied it to the horse's leg with the same efficiency he had examined it, and then sat on the edge of her stone-holding pool while the horse drank and rested. Theresa went back to her fence post. After a few minutes, he said, "Calhoun's committee met yesterday." She stopped working. "And, from what I heard, they're leaning toward extending the review another 3 months." She set down her tools slowly, breathing deliberately. 3 more months. 3 more months without being able to register cattle, without being able to enter the grazing cooperative, without being able to generate any real income from the land she had spent 3 months breaking her body to prepare. She had enough savings to last perhaps another 6 weeks. "Why?" she asked, keeping her voice even. "Because some of them don't believe a woman alone can run a viable operation, and because they want you to find a reason to quit before they have to officially deny your claim." She turned to look at him. He was watching her steadily. "That is what you heard?" she asked. "That's what I know," he said. A silence stretched between them, carrying the weight of the injustice he had just named aloud. The wind moved through the cottonwoods. The horse made soft drinking sounds. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. He took a moment before answering. "Because it's the truth," he said, "and because I watched you work this land for 3 months and what you've done here is real. It deserves to be treated as such." Theresa studied him. There was nothing in his expression that suggested he was angling for something. He did not look at her the way men sometimes looked at women alone on isolated land, with the calculation of someone assessing a vulnerability. He looked at her the way he might look at a damaged fence or a sky that was threatening a storm, with direct attention and the apparent intention of dealing with what was in front of him honestly. "Thank you for telling me," she said. He stayed another half hour until the horse was rested enough to make the slow walk back to his ranch. He did not offer help, and she did not ask for it, and somehow this was the most respectful thing about him, that he understood she was not looking for a rescuer and did not position himself as one. But after he left, she sat at the entrance of her small shelter and thought about the committee and Calhoun's 3-month extension, and she felt the first edges of real fear. Not about the land, not about the work. She was not afraid of work. She was afraid of being trapped in a game whose rules kept changing to ensure she could not win. She went back into town 2 days later and sat down with a man named Aldous Garrett, who had arrived in Redemption Creek the previous year and established himself as the territory's first proper attorney. Garrett was a precise man with wire-rimmed glasses and a dry, careful manner that she found instantly reassuring. He reviewed her father's original claim documentation, the survey, and the covenant's land management provisions, and he told her something that Calhoun had not. The covenant's land management review provision had a time limit. It could not extend beyond 6 months from the date of the heir's arrival. By that reckoning, the committee was required to issue a ruling by the 3rd week of October. If they extended beyond that without cause, the claim defaulted automatically to full approval. She returned to her land with the energy of someone who has found solid ground after a long time sinking. She pushed harder through the summer. She purchased 2 horses with her remaining savings, necessary for hauling and for the work of cattle management she planned to begin in fall. She cleared the south quarter of the property of scrub and rock, expanding her available grazing acreage. She built a proper corral adjacent to her shelter, using the same careful construction she had applied to everything else. She installed a pulley system at the spring to make the daily water work faster, freeing herself for other tasks. People in town began to notice, not with warmth at first, with something closer to bafflement. The general expectation had been that she would give up by midsummer. When she did not give up, the expectation shifted to the belief that she would run out of money and be forced to sell or abandon the claim. When she demonstrated that she was managing her resources with extraordinary care, the expectation shifted again, to a more uncomfortable place, toward the recognition that she might actually succeed, and that this success would require a reckoning with the assumptions that had underpinned every conversation about her from the start. Wallace began stopping at her boundary line more regularly, not obviously, not in a way that announced itself. He was a man who spent considerable time riding his range, and her property was adjacent to his range, and the stopping happened naturally enough. He would pause at the fence line, and she would walk over if she was near enough, and they would talk about practical things: soil moisture, cattle prices at the territorial market, the timing of the fall rains. The conversation was always functional and never personal, but it was regular, and it was honest, and Theresa found herself looking forward to it in a way that she kept to herself with some effort. In late August, a group of 3 young men from town, emboldened perhaps by some combination of boredom and resentment, rode out to her property one afternoon and pulled up half a dozen of her fence posts along the western boundary. They did not introduce themselves or make any demands. They simply pulled the posts, threw them into the dry creek bed, and rode away. She found the damage at dusk when she came back from working the south quarter. She stood looking at the gap in her fence line for a long moment, and then she took a lantern and a shovel and worked through the night replacing every post. She told no one what had happened. She reported it to no authority because she knew from the way the town worked that reporting it would result in sympathetic nods and no action, and she could not afford the cost of appearing vulnerable. She fixed it herself and let it go, at least outwardly. But she was not entirely alone. 2 days after the incident, Wallace rode to her boundary line, and she saw him studying the fresh posts along the western fence with the eyes of a man who could read work the way others read text. He said nothing specific. But when he left, he took a different route back to his ranch, one that brought his route close to her western boundary, and she noticed in the days after that his ranch hands were working the open range adjacent to that boundary more often than was strictly necessary. He was watching over her flank without saying he was doing it, and without making it an act of charity or ownership, and she found this so quietly extraordinary that it unsettled something in her she had been keeping carefully undisturbed. She began paying attention to him in a different way. She had always noticed the practical things: his efficiency, his steadiness, the way he managed his operation with a kind of contained authority that did not need to announce itself. She had noticed that he treated his ranch hands with basic decency, that he remembered names and paid fairly, and did not speak to people as though they were instruments. She had noticed that he was careful with his animals and his land in the way that people who genuinely understood ranching were always careful, because waste and cruelty were also bad strategy, and he was too intelligent for bad strategy. Now she began noticing things that were less practical. The way he listened when she spoke, fully and without interrupting, and without immediately redirecting the conversation toward what he thought instead. The fact that he asked questions about her work with genuine curiosity, not the performative interest of someone who thinks they already know the answer. The warmth that appeared at the corners of his eyes sometimes when she said something he found unexpected, a warmth that he controlled almost immediately but not quite quickly enough. She told herself these things were not relevant to her situation. She had work to do. She had a battle to win. She had a life to build that was entirely her own creation, and she had spent enough of her life in the orbit of other people's needs and expectations. She was not going to add a cattleman's heart to her list of responsibilities. She told herself this with great conviction, and believed it with perhaps 60% of her mind, and spent the other 40% noticing the exact height of the sun on the afternoons when she expected his route to bring him past her boundary line. The committee deadline arrived in mid-October. Calhoun called a formal meeting and issued the ruling that her claim was approved as a legitimate inherited title with full rights of improvement and grazing use. He delivered this ruling in the flat, precise tone of a man who has been compelled by documentation to say something he finds disagreeable. Theresa received the news in Garrett's office and walked out into the October sunshine, feeling something she had not felt in 2 years. Not happiness exactly. Something more fundamental than that. The solid certainty that she was still standing. She celebrated by purchasing 12 cattle at the territorial market the following week. 6 cows, 2 bulls, and 4 yearlings, a modest but viable beginning. She drove them back to her property herself, with Pico riding alongside to help with the trailing. The operation had begun. The winter of 1878 was harsh. The temperatures dropped earlier and harder than the previous year, and Theresa discovered quickly that managing cattle through a New Mexico territory winter involved a particular set of problems she had prepared for in theory and had to learn in practice at considerable cost. One of the bulls developed a lung infection in December. She lost 2 of the yearlings to a night storm that drove them through a section of fence weakened by frost and into the open range, from which they disappeared and were not recovered. She spent 3 weeks nursing the bull through the infection with the same willow bark and practical veterinary care she had used on Wallace's horse months earlier, and the bull survived, and she was unreasonably proud of this fact. Wallace found out about the yearlings. She did not know how. She did not tell him, and Pico was not the sort of man who gossiped. But he showed up at her fence line 3 days after they went missing and asked her directly, and she told him, and he said he would have his hands watch for them on the open range and in the arroyo to the north where stray cattle sometimes congregated. They did not recover the yearlings. But his offer was not nothing, and she accepted it as such. They began talking more that winter. The weather kept both of them working close to their respective properties rather than ranging wide, and the proximity seemed to lower some invisible barrier. He told her about his father, who had started the Barlow Ranch in the years after the war with nothing but a head full of stubbornness, and a conviction that the territory was where a man could build something real. He told her about the cattle fever outbreak of 1875 that had killed 140 head and nearly ended the operation, and the 2 years of grinding recovery work that followed. He told her these things the way people tell things they have carried a long time, not dramatically, but with the quiet intensity of something that still matters. She told him about her father, about his dreams that were always slightly larger than his capacity to realize them, about his warmth and his humor and his complete inability to manage money, which had left her with the land and very little else. She told him about her years in Santa Fe, about the bookkeeping work and the seamstress work and the particular exhaustion of supporting a sick parent while keeping herself afloat, and about the way grief, when it finally came, had felt not only like loss but also like the unexpected opening of a door she had not known existed. "You chose this," he said one evening in January. They were standing at her fence line in the fading winter light, talking over a fence post in the way they had been doing for months, which was somehow perfectly comfortable. Most people in your situation would have found someone to sell the claim to. "I thought about it," she admitted, "for about half a day." "What changed your mind?" She considered this. "I came out here and looked at it," she said, "at the grass, at the spring, at the light on it, and something in me said this is yours, and I understood for the first time what my father felt about this land even when he never managed to do anything with it. It was the idea of it, the possibility." She paused. "I couldn't sell a possibility." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something she did not expect. "That's exactly why I didn't sell during the fever years," he said. "Every sensible calculation said to cut the losses, but I couldn't sell the possibility." Their eyes met, and the recognition between them shifted in quality. It was no longer just the recognition of 2 stubborn people who understood work. It was something more interior than that, the recognition of 2 people who had made the same irrational and completely correct choice at the moment it mattered most, and who had both survived it. She looked away first. That night she lay awake for a long time, and she was honest with herself in the darkness in a way she could not quite be in the daylight. She was developing feelings for Wallace Barlow that went well beyond neighborly respect. She was developing the kind of feelings that complicated things, that created wants alongside the needs she was already managing, that introduced a vulnerability she had spent 2 years carefully avoiding. She was not afraid of the feelings. She was afraid of what they might cost her if she followed them carelessly. She had worked too hard for this land, this operation, this life she was building, to let any part of it become dependent on someone else's choices, not even someone she was beginning to trust. She decided to be careful. She decided to be honest with herself and deliberate in her behavior and patient in the way. She was patient with everything else that required time and steady work to develop properly. This was a sound and reasonable decision that held until February, when Wallace Barlow showed up at her door on a Tuesday morning during a hard freeze with a spare iron stove pipe and 2 lengths of cord wood, because he had ridden past the previous afternoon and noticed her shelter was not venting properly, and had calculated correctly that the fire she depended on for warmth was at risk of failing. He did not make a speech about it. He did not ask permission. He arrived, held up the pipe and the wood, and said, "Your flue's got a crack in it. I'll replace it if you'll hand me the tools." She handed him the tools. She watched him work with the efficient certainty of someone who fixed things as a matter of course and did not wait to be thanked for it. The new pipe went in cleanly. The fire drew properly. The shelter filled with proper warmth for the first time in a week, and Theresa realized she had been colder than she had admitted to herself. She made coffee on the newly effective stove, and they sat on opposite sides of the small room and drank it without talking for a little while, which was its own kind of communication. "You didn't have to do that," she said finally. "I know," he said. "I would have managed." "I know that too," he said, without impatience or condescension. "You would have figured it out. But it's cold, and I had the pipe, and it made sense to fix it now rather than let it go another week." This was so purely practical and so completely without calculation that she nearly laughed. She pressed her lips together and looked into her coffee and decided that deliberate and careful patience was going to be considerably harder than she had anticipated. Spring came, and with it the 2nd year of her operation. She expanded the herd, purchasing 8 more cattle at the spring market and bringing her total to 18 head, a number she could manage alone with the system she had built. She hired Pico part-time during branding season, which was the first time she had ever paid for labor on the property, and the fact that she could afford to do so felt like a milestone that deserved marking, though she marked it privately, with a good supper and a half-hour sitting by the spring in the last of the evening light. She and Wallace had settled into something by then that neither of them had named, but that everyone in Redemption Creek had noticed. He came to her boundary line 3 or 4 times a week. She came to his side of it sometimes if there was a reason, and there were usually reasons. They shared information about the cattle market, about range conditions, about the seasonal patterns of the territorial water supply. They lent each other tools. They consulted each other's judgment on questions that were easier with 2 perspectives than one, and they talked about everything. About things that were not practical at all, about books they had read and arguments about what God intended when He made a country this hard and beautiful, about the nature of fairness in a territory where the law was always catching up to the people, and rarely to everyone's benefit. He was funny in a quiet way that she did not expect and that caught her off guard regularly. She was direct in a way that seemed to consistently please him, and she was not accustomed to directness being something that pleased the men she encountered. She liked him. She liked him deeply and specifically, not as a category of person, but as this particular person, with his particular mixture of pride and generosity, and the stubbornness that was somehow never small or petty. She liked the fact that he had never once tried to manage her, or diminish her, or position her difficulty as an opportunity for his own importance. She liked the fact that when he disagreed with her, he said so directly and explained his reasoning, and then listened to hers with the same attention he had given his own. She did not say any of this to him. He was not saying things to her either, or not in words, but there were other kinds of saying. The way he always checked before he left her boundary line that she had everything she needed for the next day's work. The way he had once, in March, during a cold rain that came up fast from the south, simply held a tarpaulin over her while she completed a critical repair to her drainage system, rather than suggesting she stop for the weather. The way he had defended her once quietly in the general store, when a man had made a comment in his presence about the impropriety of a woman running cattle alone, and Wallace had said, in the same even tone he used for most things, that he found nothing improper in useful work done well, and had gone back to purchasing his salt and cartridges without further editorial. She had not been present for this. Pico had told her, in his offhand way, mentioning it as though it was a detail she might find interesting, and not as though it was the kind of thing that would stay with her for weeks. The situation with Calhoun and the town council had never fully resolved. Calhoun had accepted the ruling on her claim, but he had not accepted her. He had continued, in his measured and powerful way, to treat her operation as something slightly illegitimate, something that existed outside the proper order of Redemption Creek's community life. She was not invited to join the cattle cooperative that organized shared grazing agreements and market access for the local ranchers. She was not included in the town meetings where land use and water rights were discussed. When she attended those meetings anyway, which she did with consistent regularity, she was listened to with the particular politeness that is a form of dismissal. It came to a head in August of 1879, the second summer of her operation. A water rights dispute arose between two of the larger operations in the area, and the town council called a meeting to establish a new allocation framework for the seasonal creek that ran through her northern boundary. This creek fed water to her spring-fed pool in high water months, and the allocation decision would directly affect her grazing capacity. She had a legal and practical stake in the outcome that was as significant as any of the men at the table. Calhoun refused to seat her at the table, not in a dramatic way, not with any explicit statement. He simply continued the meeting as though she were not there, redirecting the conversation whenever she spoke, acknowledging the men around the table and looking past her whenever she raised her hand. The message was as clear as a surveyor's mark in fresh ground. This was the moment. Not quite the moment in the town hall, but the moment that led to it. Because Wallace Barlow was also at that meeting, seated at the council table in his capacity as one of the territory's largest ranchers, and he watched the entire process for approximately 40 minutes before he put his hands flat on the table and said, in a voice that was absolutely without performance, "I want to hear what Miss Dalton has to say about the creek allocation." The table went quiet. "She has land on the northern bank," he said. "She has a legal claim and an established operation that depends on that water. She has as much right to speak in this room as any man here." Calhoun had looked at him with the expression of someone processing an unexpected complication. "Mr. Barlow, this is a matter of the cooperative's members." "Then she should be a member of the cooperative," Wallace said. "And if she isn't, that is a failure of the cooperative's fairness, not of her qualifications." The table had erupted, and the meeting had dissolved into argument, and nothing had been resolved that afternoon. But the word had gone out through Redemption Creek, the way words always went out in small towns, rapidly and with embellishment. And by the following morning, everyone in town knew that Wallace Barlow had publicly challenged Elder Calhoun on the subject of Theresa Dalton. This put them both in an impossible position and created between them a new and electric quality that had not been there before. She went to find him the next morning. She found him at the Barlow Ranch's main corral, working a young horse on a long lead line, and she stood at the fence and waited until he had finished and came to her. "You didn't need to do that," she said. "It was the truth," he said. "You had the right to speak." "I know I had the right. What I'm asking is why you said it when saying it cost you something." He looked at her for a long moment. The horse moved restlessly behind him. The morning light was doing something complicated with the shadows between them. because not saying it would have cost more, he said. She heard something in this that was not just about the water rights meeting, and he seemed to know she heard it, and for a moment neither of them moved. The space between them had a quality of suspension, of something balanced on an edge, and she was aware of every detail of the moment with the heightened clarity of something important. "Wallace," she said, and stopped. "I know," he said. "Do you?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "I've known for a while. I didn't say anything because I thought you needed me not to say anything. That you needed the space to build what you were building without anyone adding complications." This was so precisely accurate that she felt something inside her chest shift in a way that was uncomfortable and entirely right. "I did need that," she said. "And now," he asked. The morning light moved. The horse settled. A meadowlark called from somewhere in the long grass to the east. "Now I'm asking why you said it," she said, which was its own kind of answer, and they both understood it as such. He reached over the fence rail and took her hand, not with drama, simply with the same deliberate certainty he applied to everything. His hand was large and calloused and warm, and she let him hold hers, and standing at the fence of his corral in the August morning, she felt for the first time in as long as she could remember that her life was not only something she was defending but something she was choosing, something she wanted, all of it, the land and the work and this man and whatever came next. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "If you'll allow it." "I'll allow it," she said. "But you should know that properly for me doesn't mean what it means in town. I'm not going to stop working my land or managing my operation." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to. And if you ever try to manage me the way Calhoun tries to manage this town, I won't," he said, and the certainty in his voice was the same certainty she had seen him apply to horses and fence lines and cattle fever, completely without doubt. "Then we understand each other," she said. He smiled then, a real smile, not the controlled warmth at the corners of his eyes but the full version, and it changed his face entirely in a way that made her suddenly understand what he must have looked like as a young man before all the responsibility settled in. She felt her own answering smile on her face before she could think about it. The days that followed held a different quality, the same work, the same land, the same practical daily grind of running a cattle operation, but something warm running through all of it. He came to her fence line with the same regularity, but now he came around it, coming onto her property with her invitation, walking her land with her, learning its specific character the way he knew his own land's character. He was curious about every decision she had made, about the drainage system and the corral placement, and the particular way she had positioned the shelter to take advantage of the morning sun. He asked and listened and occasionally offered a different perspective, and she engaged with his perspective on its merits and disagreed with him freely when she disagreed, and he responded to this with what she could only describe as delight. He took her riding on Sunday afternoons, which was the day she allowed herself a portion of rest. They rode the range country together, out to the edges of the open land, where the territory spread in every direction without boundary, the great breathing space of the West that you had to live inside to understand. He knew this country intimately, every wash and ridge and the particular angle of each season's light, and sharing it with him was like being given a second language for something she had only been able to gesture at before. She cooked for him sometimes in her small shelter, simple food, beans and salt pork and biscuits, and occasionally a rabbit stew if she had been lucky with a snare. He ate whatever she made with evident appreciation and brought her things in return, coffee and dried fruit from a supply trip to the territorial market, and once a bolt of good wool cloth he had purchased in town because he had heard her mention that her winter coat was wearing thin. He left it at her door with no note, which she found so entirely characteristic of him that she stood holding it for a full minute before she could make herself go back to work. The courting had been going on for 6 weeks when the situation with Calhoun escalated to its crisis point. The water rights framework that had been under discussion, all summer was finally put to a formal vote at a special council session in September. Theresa had submitted, through Garrett, a written statement of her legal interests in the creek allocation, with documentation of the spring's output, her herd size, and her projected water needs. She had done this carefully, precisely, with every supporting figure she could provide. Calhoun's council voted to allocate the creek's late-season flow in a way that entirely excluded her northern pasture from priority access, giving preference to the three largest operations, all owned by men who had been in the cooperative for years. The allocation was technically legal under the covenant's provisions, and Garrett had told her that challenging it would be difficult and expensive, and would take time she could not afford during the operational year. But there was more. Calhoun had also passed a resolution, embedded in the Water Rights Framework document, that defined established grazing operations for cooperative membership purposes in a way that required 5 years of continuous operation and minimum herd sizes that her operation could not yet meet. It was written precisely enough to be legal, and specifically enough to mean only one thing: that she would be excluded from the cooperative for another 3 years at minimum. She did not cry when Garrett explained this to her. She went home and worked until dark and made a plan and went to bed. The plan was clear and required only her own resources and sustained effort, which were the only resources she had ever fully trusted. But Wallace found out about the resolution. She had not told him, for reasons she did not fully examine, some combination of pride and protectiveness of his position in the community, not wanting to pull him deeper into a conflict that would cost him. He found out anyway, through the same channels that information always traveled in Redemption Creek. He showed up at her door the evening of the day he found out, and she could see from the controlled stillness of his posture that he was containing something very large and very hot. He buried a membership exclusion in the water rights document, he said. I know, she said. You didn't tell me. She met his eyes steadily. I didn't want to use your position in this community as a tool for my problems. Your problems are not separate from mine, he said. This stopped her. The simple directness of it, the way it moved the line between his life and hers without asking permission, landed with a weight that was not unwelcome but that she needed a moment to absorb. Wallace, no, he said. I'm not going to stand outside this and watch Calhoun use the covenant as a weapon, not against you, not when what you've built here is real and the exclusion is dishonest. What are you going to do? She asked. I'm going to call a full town meeting, he said, and I'm going to say what needs to be said. She remembered then, at this moment, the conversation he had with her a month earlier about his father and the war years and the conviction that had built the Barlow Ranch into what it was. A man built the way his father had been built, by hardship and principle. A man who had spent 33 years learning that staying quiet in the face of dishonesty was not neutrality but complicity. She wanted to stop him. She wanted to tell him that she could manage, that she didn't need this, that the cost to his relationships in town and his standing on the council was too high a price for a battle that was ultimately hers to fight. She wanted to protect him from the consequences of his own decency. She didn't say any of it. Be careful what you say, she told him instead. Say what's true and say only what's true and don't make it about me specifically. Make it about the principle. He looked at her for a long moment. It is about you specifically, he said. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. She took a breath. Then say the truth, she said. He called the town meeting for the following Thursday. The notice went up at the general store and the church and the town hall in Wallace Barlow's name, which meant it was taken seriously in a way that a notice in Theresa's name would not have been, and this fact was its own kind of evidence of the injustice being addressed. Theresa spent the days before the meeting doing what she always did, working. She was up before dawn, feeding cattle, checking fences, monitoring the holding pools level as the creek dropped toward its fall low-water mark. She made note of every measurement, every figure, every piece of documentation that spoke to the reality of what she had built on this land in 2 years, with nothing but her own labor and judgment. She thought about Wallace constantly. She thought about the moment at the fence post when he had taken her hand. She thought about Sunday afternoons on the open range. She thought about the bolt of wool cloth he had left at her door, and the way he had held a tarpaulin over her in the rain so she could finish a repair, and the morning he had replaced her flue pipe in the January cold, and she understood with the clarity that only quiet and honest reflection produces that she loved him. Not the cautious, limited, conditional kind of caring she had allowed herself to acknowledge before, the real kind, the kind that made a person's life larger rather than smaller, the kind that felt like the possibility she had stood in her land and decided she couldn't sell. She was still turning this over when Thursday came. The town hall filled up that night in a way it rarely did. Curiosity was a powerful organizing force in small communities, and Wallace Barlow calling a public meeting was unusual enough to draw people who might not otherwise have attended. The room held perhaps 50 people, which was most of the adult population of the immediate area. Calhoun was there, of course, at the head of the table, with 3 other council members on either side of him. He had the expression of a man prepared to be patient with a necessary unpleasantness. Wallace stood at the front of the room without sitting. He did not have notes. He did not need them. He laid out the situation with the clarity of a man who had spent several days organizing his thoughts into their most essential form. He described the covenant's original provisions. He described Theresa's legal claim, her 2 years of documented work, her herd, her improvements, her contributions to the territory's economic productivity. He described the water rights resolution and the membership exclusion buried within it. He named it, without equivocation, as an act designed to exclude a qualified operator from fair participation in the community's economic life, for reasons that had nothing to do with the quality of her work or the legitimacy of her claim. He said other things. He said that the covenant had been written to protect fair dealing and community integrity, not to enforce the preferences of any individual or group about who deserved to participate. He said that the exclusion of a productive landowner from cooperative membership on the basis of terms specifically written to apply to one person was a corruption of the covenant's purpose. And then he said the thing that would be talked about in Redemption Creek for years afterward. She has outworked every man here, he said, and his voice was even and certain and entirely without apology, his eyes on Calhoun, and she deserves their respect. The room erupted, and Theresa, standing in the doorway where she had been standing for the previous 10 minutes, felt the exact moment when everything shifted. Calhoun rose. The other council members rose. The room divided, loudly and not always politely, between the people who agreed and the people who didn't, and the argument that had been building under the surface of Redemption Creek for 2 years came fully above ground with the kind of noise that real disagreement makes. Theresa walked into the room. She walked to the front, through the crowd, and people moved out of her way in the way people move when someone is clearly going somewhere specific and won't be redirected. She came to stand beside Wallace, not behind him, not in front of him, but level with him, and she faced the council table and the room. "I would like to speak," she said, in a voice that carried clearly over the noise. The room did not go entirely quiet, but it settled enough. She spoke for 8 minutes. She presented her figures. She described her documented water usage. She explained what the proposed creek allocation would mean for her herd through the following winter. She described the membership exclusion-specific provisions and noted, with the precision Garrett had given her, exactly why they failed to meet the covenant's own standard of good faith dealing. She did not raise her voice. She did not apologize for being there. She spoke the way she worked, with direct efficiency and complete knowledge of her subject, and she watched the room receive it. Not everyone was convinced. Several of the older men in the room had expressions that made clear they would have preferred not to be confronted with this level of competence and clarity. But others, more than she had expected, had expressions that were moving from skeptical to thoughtful, and thoughtful was what she needed. Calhoun attempted to respond by questioning the Covenant's application to her situation. Wallace answered every point immediately and with the same precision. Garrett, who had been sitting quietly near the back, added two clarifying legal citations that effectively closed two of Calhoun's escape routes. The meeting ran for nearly 3 hours. At the end of it, there was no formal vote, because Calhoun was shrewd enough to know he didn't have one to win tonight. But there was a public record of the challenge, a room full of witnesses to the argument, and a clear demonstration that the exclusion could not survive legal scrutiny if pursued. Over the following 2 weeks, under pressure from Wallace and from 3 other ranchers who had been quietly uncomfortable with the situation and whose discomfort was now public, the council revised the water rights allocation to include Theresa's northern pasture in the late-season priority list. The membership exclusion was removed from the framework document. In a letter from the cooperative's board, drafted with obvious reluctance but signed by all 7 members including Calhoun, extended membership to Theresa Dalton's operation effective with the fall season. She received the letter at her door on a Tuesday morning and read it twice, and then went to find Wallace. He was at the south end of his range, checking the condition of a water trough, and he saw her coming from a distance and walked toward her. She held out the letter and he read it, and when he looked up she could see the satisfaction in his face that he was not trying to hide. "Garrett's draft helped," he said. "Your speech helped more," she said. "Your 8 minutes helped most," he said. "You won that room." She took the letter back and folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket. The October air was sharp and clean. The grass was going gold along the creek banks and the cottonwood leaves had turned yellow and were beginning to release in the wind. "I want to tell you something," she said. "All right," he said, with the stillness he used when he was paying full attention. "I love you," she said, with the same directness she brought to everything. "Not because of what happened in that meeting room, though I understand now exactly what kind of man you are, and that is not a small part of it, but before that, since February. Since the stove pipe." He looked at her for a moment, and the warmth at the corners of his eyes was not controlled this time, not at all, it was fully present and entirely clear. "Since March," he said, "since you stood in the rain and finished that drainage repair." "You held a tarpaulin over my head for 40 minutes, she said. "You were going to finish the repair regardless," he said. "It was a reasonable decision." She laughed then, genuinely, and it felt like the first entirely free laugh she had managed in 2 years, and his answering expression was so full and warm that it made her chest ache in the most welcome way she had ever felt. He crossed the remaining distance between them and took both of her hands, and when he kissed her, it was with the same contained certainty he brought to everything important, deliberate and real, and entirely without performance. The autumn moved around them with its particular western quality, the big sky going deep blue in the cold afternoons, and the distant mountains catching the first of the winter snow, and they worked their respective lands and moved between them with the easy familiarity of 2 people who have finally stopped pretending to be careful around each other. He asked her to marry him in December at her spring in the late afternoon, with the winter light going orange across the grass and the cattle moving at the far edge of the pasture. He did not have a ring, which he apologized for, and she told him she didn't care about a ring, and he told her he would get one, and she told him to focus on the question, and he laughed, which was becoming her favorite sound in the territory. She said yes. They were married in March of 1880 at the Redemption Creek Church, which was a smaller ceremony than some people might have expected from 2 landowners whose combined holdings represented a significant portion of the territory's productive grazing acreage, but which was exactly what both of them wanted. Pico was there, and Garrett, and a handful of the ranchers who had come to genuinely respect Theresa's operation over the previous 2 years, and 2 of Wallace's ranch hands who had worked for the Barlow operation for years, and who embraced Theresa with the same matter-of-fact acceptance they brought to most changes in their world. Calhoun did not attend. This surprised no one and concerned no one. The question of the land, their respective holdings, was resolved practically and legally, in a way that Garrett drew up and both of them reviewed carefully. Theresa retained full title to her 47 acres and her operation independently. The Barlow Ranch remained in Wallace's name. There was a legal partnership agreement that covered the shared management they intended to develop, including consolidated grazing agreements and joint cooperative membership that recognized both operations as a combined entity for the purpose of market access. It was not the way most couples in 1880 New Mexico territory organized their property, but it was the way they organized it, and Garrett said it was sound, and it was. The first spring of their marriage, the combined operation ran at a scale that neither of them had quite reached alone. The consolidated grazing agreements gave them better range access. The shared labor, with Wallace's experienced hands working across both properties, allowed each piece of land to be managed more intensively. The market access through the cooperative, now available to both operations, meant better prices for their cattle at the fall sale. Theresa was not subsumed into the Barlow operation. This had been the outcome that people in town had expected and assumed, and in some cases hoped for, the natural resolution of her story being absorbed into an existing and established structure. It did not happen. She ran her 47 acres with the same direct authority she always had, and the combined operations decisions were made jointly, with the particular dynamic of two people who were genuinely equal in their understanding of the work and genuinely honest with each other about their disagreements. They had disagreements. Relatively frequent ones, in fact, because they were both opinionated and both certain of themselves, and because the daily operational decisions of a combined cattle operation provided ample material for differing views. The disagreements were conducted with a directness and a mutual respect that would have surprised people who assumed that productive argument required someone to consistently lose. In their case, the right answer usually emerged from the collision of perspectives, and neither of them was too proud to adopt the other's position when it was demonstrably better. They had moved into a larger house by that first winter of marriage, built on the Barlow Ranch's main property with timber and adobe and real glass in the windows, a proper house with 2 bedrooms, and a kitchen with a cast iron stove, and a covered porch that faced east toward Theresa's land. From the porch you could see the cottonwoods along the northern creek, and the line of fence posts she had first driven into the hardpan ground 3 years earlier, and she found it an almost unbearably satisfying view. She brought her old shelter down herself, taking it apart with the same methodical care she had built it with. She kept the stones from the spring lining and used them to build a low wall around the spring's pool, a proper permanent structure that would serve the operation for years. The small shelter had been a beginning, not an ending, and she understood that completely. In the late summer of 1880, she discovered she was pregnant. She told Wallace on the porch in the evening, directly and without preamble, which was how she told him most things. He sat very still for a moment, and then a look came across his face that she had not seen before, something entirely unguarded and young and overwhelmed, and he said, "Are you certain?" "I wouldn't say it if I wasn't," she said. He reached over and took her hand, which was by now a completely natural gesture between them, and held it with a grip that was slightly stronger than his usual steadiness, the way a man holds something precious that he is slightly afraid to squeeze too hard. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said. "I've been fine for 2 months. I was waiting to be certain before I said anything." 2 months, he said. "I was certain this morning," she said. He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips to her knuckles, and she felt the warmth of this simple gesture all the way through her, and she leaned her head against his shoulder because the porch and the evening light and the view of her cottonwoods was exactly the right setting for this moment, and she wanted to stay inside it a little longer. Their son, Robert Wallace Barlow, was born in the spring of 1881, the same season as the calves and the new grass, the season of beginnings. He was named for both of the men who had built the foundations his parents stood on. Theresa's father, who had dreamed impractically but truly, and Wallace's father, who had built something real from a conviction that the territory was worth the cost. Theresa recovered from the birth with the same efficient determination she brought to everything, and was back to light work at the northern pasture within 3 weeks, carrying Robert in a cloth carrier. She had stitched herself from the wool of that first bolt of cloth Wallace had left at her door. She modified her work schedule to accommodate the baby with the same practical inventiveness she had applied to every other operational problem, and the baby adapted to the rhythm of the land with the equanimity of someone who had been born into it. Wallace was besotted in a way that he seemed mildly surprised by. He had understood, abstractly, that he would love his child. He had not understood the specific quality of it, the way it was entirely different from every other attachment he had formed, entirely without calculation or consideration of anything practical. He simply loved the boy with a totality that he expressed in the way he expressed most important things, through sustained attention and daily action, holding him in the evenings when Theresa needed her hands free, walking the porch with him in the small hours when the boy was wakeful, telling him, in a quiet voice, about the cattle and the range, and the way the light changed on the mountains at different seasons. Theresa watched this from across the room sometimes, and felt the fullness of her life as an almost physical pressure in her chest. Calhoun had stepped back from active council leadership the previous year, citing his age, though everyone understood that the town meeting of October 1879 had shifted something in the community's relationship with his particular brand of authority. The new council chair was a younger man named Prescott, who had arrived in Redemption Creek in 1879 and who had none of Calhoun's investment in the previous order. He treated Theresa's operation with the simple practical respect that its economic scale warranted, and the water rights and cooperative membership that had been fought for so publicly became, within 2 years, simply the established situation, unremarkable in its normalcy. This was the best possible outcome, not that the injustice was remembered and celebrated in its overcoming, but that it became so thoroughly corrected that the correction itself became invisible, that Theresa Dalton Barlow's place in the community's economic life became too obvious to question. In 1882, a late-season drought hit the territory hard. The seasonal creek dried entirely by August, which had not happened in the previous 3 years, and the holding pool's level dropped at a rate that forced difficult decisions about herd size. The larger operations in the territory were hit hardest because they had been running cattle numbers calibrated to average water years and could not reduce quickly enough to match the drought's pace. The Barlow-Dalton operation, as people in town had begun calling the combined enterprise, weathered it better than most. Theresa's original careful calibration of herd size to her spring's confirmed output had built a conservative baseline into their combined numbers, and the holding pool's stone-lined capacity held reserves that the neighboring operations did not have. They reduced their herd in early July rather than August, before prices fell, selling 30 head at the territorial market at prices that would not be available 2 months later. It was a significant financial loss against the planned year, but it was managed loss, the kind of loss you could absorb and recover from. Wallace said afterward that the decision to sell early had saved the operation. Theresa said it had been obvious when she did the water calculations. He said the calculations had been brilliant. She said they had been basic mathematics. He said there was nothing basic about it because 4 other operations had not done the same calculation. She said those 4 operations had not been built on 47 acres with a single spring and the explicit requirement that everything be accounted for, because there had been nothing else to fall back on. He looked at her with the warmth that had never diminished, not by a single degree, in the 4 years they had been together and said, "That's the lesson, isn't it? Building from nothing teaches you to account for everything. She looked back at him across the supper table with their son's dark head bent over a piece of cornbread between them, and felt the settled certainty of a life that was exactly what she had chosen, with all of its difficulty and all of its satisfaction. And she thought that there was no word adequate to the feeling except gratitude. The drought broke in October. The rains came early and heavy, and the creek ran high through November in a way that restored the holding pool and the soil moisture, and the hope of a normal following year. They spent the late autumn rebuilding their herd with strategic purchases, using their preserved capital to buy young stock at prices depressed by the drought's aftermath, a reinvestment that would pay forward over the following years. In 1883, they received an offer to purchase both operations from a land speculation company based in Santa Fe that was acquiring territory ranches in advance of anticipated railroad development. The offer was financially significant, enough to provide comfortable independence in any city for the rest of their lives. They sat with the letter on the porch for one evening and looked at the land and talked it through with the completeness they brought to every major decision. They considered the railroad and what it would mean for the territory's cattle operations, both the opportunities it would create and the competitive pressures from larger-scale operations it would enable. They considered their son, now a solid 2-year-old who could name every animal in the corral, and had recently begun following his father to the fence line with the earnest purposefulness of someone who took his responsibilities seriously. They considered what they each had built and why. The answer was clear before they had finished talking, not because the financial offer wasn't real, but because the land was more real. You could not sell a possibility. Neither of them had ever been able to, and neither of them intended to start now. They declined the offer with a brief and courteous letter and went back to work the following morning. The following spring, Theresa told Wallace she was expecting again. She told him the same way she had told him the first time, directly and in the evening, sitting on the porch. His reaction was essentially the same as the first time, the stillness and the unguarded look and the question about whether she was certain. And she told him that she would really not bring it up if she was not certain, and he said he knew that. He just needed a moment, and she told him to take whatever moment he needed, and he laughed in the way that was her favorite sound in the territory. Their daughter, Eleanor June Barlow, was born in November of 1884, named for no one in particular, but for the month of June because it was the month Theresa had arrived on her land, and the month she always associated with beginnings. The baby had dark hair like her father and her mother's direct gaze, and from her first weeks she observed the world around her with an attention that was already unmistakably characteristic. Robert, now 3, greeted his sister with an initial wariness that dissolved within a week into a proprietary affection that had him positioning himself beside her cradle whenever anyone else came near, not out of anxiety, but out of the particular seriousness with which he approached all of his responsibilities. Theresa watched this and felt something enormous and warm in her chest that she recognized as the specific joy of watching children learn to love each other. In 1885, Calhoun died. He was buried in the Redemption Creek churchyard with the respectful attendance of most of the community, because he had been a founding figure and a genuinely significant presence in the territory's early years, whatever his failures of judgment on the subject of Theresa's place in the community's life. Wallace attended the service. Theresa attended the service. She stood at the graveside with Eleanor on her hip and Robert holding her other hand, and she thought about the old man's certainty about the natural order of things, and the way that certainty had been wrong without making him entirely irredeemable. And she thought that the most honest epitaph for most people was probably something like, a product of their time who sometimes made things harder for others, and sometimes made things possible, and did not always know the difference. She kept her thoughts private, as she usually did, and walked back to the wagon with Wallace's hand at the small of her back, steady and warm. The years that followed settled into a rhythm that was full and demanding and deeply satisfying in the way that only things built with real effort and maintained with real commitment can be. The operation grew. The cattle numbers increased as the land's capacity was better understood and its management refined. The cooperative membership gave them market access that made the growth financially sound rather than speculative. Wallace's reputation as a fair and clear-headed rancher continued and deepened, and Theresa's reputation, which had once been a subject of controversy, had become something simpler and more solid. She was known as one of the best land managers in the territory, someone whose water conservation work and grazing rotation practices were discussed at the territorial ranchers' meetings with the respect that results from demonstrable consistent success. She wrote down her methods. Not for publication, initially, just for herself, the systematic documentation of what she had learned about managing the land in its specific local character, its water patterns and soil composition, and the particular way its grass grew through drought and wet years. But a young woman named Clara arrived in the territory in 1886, her husband having died on the journey west, and Clara had a small land claim east of Theresa's and no idea how to begin working it, and Theresa gave her the documentation. She also gave her 2 days of her time, walking the land with her, explaining the drainage, showing her how to assess the spring's output, describing the most efficient order of improvements. She did this without drama and without the sense of doing something exceptional, because it was simply useful, and Clara needed it, and Theresa had needed something similar when she arrived in 1878 and had not received it. Clara's operation became viable within 18 months, and Clara became one of Theresa's genuine friends, which was a category of person that Theresa's self-sufficiency had not previously prioritized, but that she found, once she allowed it, to be one of the more valuable things in her life. Robert Barlow grew up on the land with the unhurried certainty of someone who has never needed to question where they belong. He worked alongside his parents from the time he was old enough to be useful, and became useful earlier than either of them expected, with the practical intelligence of a child who has spent his whole life in an environment where work is observable and learnable and respected. By the time he was 12, he could be trusted with a morning's cattle check across the north pasture without supervision, and he did it with the same methodical reliability that characterized both of his parents. Eleanor grew up with a different character, but no less certain. She was curious about everything and opinionated about most of it, and she had inherited her mother's directness in a concentrated form that occasionally alarmed people meeting her for the first time, and that her parents found consistently delightful. She wanted to know how things worked and why, and she asked questions with the same persistence and genuine interest that Theresa recognized from her own childhood as the particular kind of intelligence that is not content with partial answers. In 1888, Theresa turned 36 and Wallace turned 42, and they had been married for 8 years, and they were still as honest with each other as they had been at the fence post on the morning of their first real conversation, which was the foundation of everything else, the willingness to say what was true even when it was difficult, and the practice of listening when it was received. On the anniversary of the town meeting, they sometimes talked about it in the evenings on the porch, not with bitterness or triumphalism, but with the honest accounting of people who have lived through something important and want to understand it fully. They talked about what had been unjust and why, about the kind of certainty that Calhoun had carried, and that had made him both effective and harmful, about the ways that communities protect themselves against change, and the cost of that protection to the people who need them to change. They talked about what Wallace's speech had meant, and Theresa was always clear that the speech had mattered in the specific context it had been made, that his voice in that room had created space for hers in a way that nothing she could have done alone that night would have achieved, and that this was not comfortable to acknowledge because it contained within it a real injustice, the fact that her voice had required his amplification to be heard, and that the injustice was worth naming even as the outcome was worth being grateful for. Wallace agreed. He said this was the part he was least at peace with, not that he had spoken, but that his speaking had been necessary because it meant the room had been calibrated in a way that should not exist, and that his action had corrected the symptom while the underlying condition had required longer to change. "Is it changed?" she asked once. "More than it was," he said. "Less than it should be." He looked at her steadily. "But you're here. The land is yours." Eleanor and Robert grow up in a world where a woman running her own operation is something they've never thought to question. "That's not nothing." "It's not everything," she said. "No," he said, "but it's what we built. And building forward is all we have." She put her head on his shoulder, the way she had been doing on this porch for 8 years, and looked out at the cottonwoods in the fading light, and felt the truth of this settle into her the way all real things settle, not with a single dramatic moment, but with the accumulated weight of everything that was daily and ordinary and deeply, completely hers. In 1889, New Mexico Territory was progressing toward its eventual statehood, and with that progress came the expansion of legal frameworks that began to more formally recognize property rights for women in ways the old covenant never had. Garrett, who had been practicing law in Redemption Creek for over a decade by then, sent Theresa a note when the relevant territorial legislation passed, a simple line in his precise handwriting. "Your documents were always in order. Now the law has caught up to the facts." She kept the note. She put it in the cedar box where she kept the original surveyor's map and her father's death certificate and the first deed to her land and the letter of cooperative membership and a few other things that were the paper record of her life's central chapter. She kept it because Garrett had been right, and because the law catching up to the facts was worth marking. That fall, at the territorial ranchers' meeting, Theresa was asked to speak on water conservation practices. She stood at the front of a room of 60 ranchers and presented her documentation, her 12 years of records from the northern spring and the holding pool and the seasonal creek, the evidence of what careful calibrated management had produced across drought years and wet years and everything in between. She spoke for 20 minutes with the same direct efficiency she had brought to every 8-minute, every 40-minute, every 3-hour speech she had made in rooms that had not always wanted to hear her. The room listened. The room asked questions. Some of the questions were good ones. She answered all of them. Wallace sat in the third row and watched her with the expression he always had when he watched her work, a combination of pride and genuine admiration, and something that was simply personal and warm and entirely his own. On the drive home in the wagon that evening, with Robert half asleep in the back and Eleanor asking pointed questions about the specific mechanics of drought management that neither of them had expected to field at that hour, Wallace reached over and took Theresa's hand where it rested on the wagon seat, and she turned her palm up and held his. And the October stars came out above the territory, and the road home moved beneath them, and the cottonwoods were waiting at the edge of the land she had built from a surveyor's map and a death certificate, and the conviction that you could not sell a possibility. Everything she had hoped for and fought for and built had taken its full and complicated shape around her. The land and the cattle and the law finally aligned with the facts. The children who would inherit something real and know that they inherited it from both of their parents equally. The man beside her who had stood in a room and said her name, and said the truth about her without being asked, and without requiring anything in return. And then spent the years after that being consistently and daily the person his word implied. The night was clear and cold, and the road was long, and she was entirely, precisely where she chose to be. She held his hand and drove home, and the territory spread in every direction around them, the great breathing space of the West, full of possibility, full of the proof of what sustained and honest labor could build, full of the particular beauty that belongs to a life that is genuinely one's own. Robert stirred in the back of the wagon and asked sleepily if they were nearly home, and Wallace told him yes, nearly. And Alina produced a question about star formation that required a detailed response. And Theresa answered it in full, because Alina's questions always deserved full answers. And the wagon moved through the October night toward the lights of the house on the Barlow Range, toward the warm kitchen and the cedar box and the porch that looked east toward the cottonwoods, toward everything that was real and made, and kept by two people who had chosen each other with the same honest certainty they had chosen the land. And that was the whole of it. The hidden motive that turned out not to be a motive at all, but simply decency. The secrets that turned out not to be secrets, but simply things that had not yet been said. The forbidden thing that turned out not to be forbidden, only difficult, only requiring the specific courage of standing up in a room and saying what was true and accepting the cost of it. The sacrifice that turned out to be the opposite of sacrifice, the thing freely given that returned multiplied, as real things always do. The land was hers, the life was hers, the love was mutual and equal and completely, entirely real. And in the spring that followed, when the grass came green again and the creek ran high along the northern boundary, and the calves arrived in the new season's light, Theresa stood at her spring with Wallace beside her, and felt what she had felt the first time she stood on this land, that particular quality of possibility, and understood that 12 years in, the possibility had not diminished but had deepened, had put down roots as deep as the cottonwoods along the creek, had become something she could not have imagined in full on that first April afternoon, something made from everything that had been demanded and given and chosen and built, something worth every single inch of it. The meadowlark sang from the long grass, and the morning was entirely clear, and they went to work.